The Anatomy of an Economic War, a turning point in the story of Washington and Ottawa. A piece of news arrived with the first light of morning and dismantled an order that had been carefully constructed over decades. One of the world's most deeply rooted trade partnerships became unrecognizable overnight. But this transformation was neither the product of sudden rage nor an impulsive decision. It was the inevitable outcome of a long-range strategy executed quietly in the background. The trade relationship between the United States and Canada was perhaps the most complex and functional example in the history of modern economics. The two countries' economies were so thoroughly interwoven that factories, farms, and energy facilities on both sides of the border operated as a single vast machine. A car rolling off a Michigan assembly line likely carried components that had crossed the Canada-US border 15 times during production. Crude oil flowing south from Ontario was the lifeblood of refineries across the Midwest. This integration was not merely an economic fact. It was the shared inheritance of a civilization shaped over decades by political will, trade agreements, and mutual trust. All of it is now under threat, the strategy behind the silence. Observers in Washington misread Ottawa's initial response. The quiet that followed Donald Trump's escalating economic pressure on Canada was not, as many analysts assumed, a signal of surrender. On the contrary, it was a deliberate, calculated, and extraordinarily careful component of a strategy. For 3 full days, not a single statement, not a single leaked detail, not a single background briefing-sourced story emerged from Prime Minister Mark Carney's office. American media interpreted this silence as a sign of collapse. Some outlets ran headlines implying that Canada's resistance had buckled. Analysis attributed to White House-adjacent sources claimed Ottawa had called Washington seeking to return to the negotiating table. None of it was true. The real reason for Canada's silence was simple. They were not negotiating. They were building. Carney's team used those 3 days to prepare a simultaneous global move. Encrypted channels were opened with Brussels. Hours of technical consultations were held with Tokyo. Coordination was established with Seoul, London, and Canberra. No one saw it. No one heard it. Not until everything was in place. The Brussels press conference, 3 bombs one morning. Before the markets opened, before Trump had finished his morning routine, Mark Carney stepped to a podium, not in Ottawa, in Brussels. The president of the European Commission stood beside him. The Prime Minister of Japan appeared on a screen behind them via live feed. Carney made 3 announcements that morning. Each one landed harder than the last, and Washington had seen none of them coming. First move, the Emergency Economic Partnership with Europe. The first announcement declared the establishment of a comprehensive emergency economic partnership between Canada and the European Union. This was no ordinary trade deal. It was a framework, moving rapidly into force, that included mutual recognition of standards, shared regulatory structures, and preferential market access. Why did this matter so profoundly? Because Canadian manufacturers, farmers, and energy companies could now remain competitive without access to the American market. The threat created by U.S. tariffs was being counterbalanced by a newly opened door to European consumers. Moreover, that door had been prepared months in advance, before Trump's moves had even solidified through Carney's foresight. Markets responded far faster than politicians could react. Within 90 minutes of the announcement, the euro-Canadian dollar pair moved more sharply than it had in 6 months. European energy stocks climbed. Canadian oil companies that had been hammered by tariff fears gained close to 9% in a single day. Money spoke before commentary did. Second move, the Pacific Energy Corridor. The second announcement sent a genuine shockwave through the White House. Carney revealed that an accelerated energy agreement had been signed with Japan and South Korea. Under this arrangement, Canada's exports of liquefied natural gas and heavy crude oil would be redirected away from the traditional southern route and toward Pacific markets, toward Asia. Pipeline and port infrastructure along the British Columbia coast would enter an accelerated construction phase, enabled by emergency powers invoked under national economic security. This was not merely a shift in economic policy. Its symbolic weight was undeniable. Carney was a figure who had run the Bank of England, who had lectured the world on climate finance. Now that same Carney was sidelining environmental review processes to begin pipeline construction. It could be read as the triumph of pragmatism over ideology, a leader doing what was necessary to keep his country alive. But the deeper message was far more significant. Canada no longer had to remain bound to a single buyer. For decades, the U.S. had been the dominant customer of Canadian energy, and that reality had given Washington an enormous source of leverage. Carney was neutralizing that leverage, not on a 10-year timeline, in 18 months. Why did this terrify Washington so acutely? Refineries across the Midwest and Gulf Coast had been engineered specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. Retrofitting those facilities to handle lighter crude from the Middle East would require years of work and billions of dollars in investment. A redirection of Canadian energy flows represented an existential threat to those facilities. Carney did not cut off the oil today. He simply proved he could cut it off tomorrow. And Wall Street began pricing in that difference immediately. U.S. refinery stocks fell 6% during the day's trading. The emergency note Goldman Sachs sent to clients carried just 2 words: supply risk. Third move, the Digital Alliance and America's exclusion. The third announcement was the least expected of all 3. Carney declared that Canada was forming a joint digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence development pact with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia. The agreement covered shared data standards, AI safety frameworks, and the mutual recognition of digital intellectual property, and it had one feature that cut deep. The United States was not part of it. Read that again. 5 major Western economies built a technology alliance and did not extend an invitation to America. To understand what this means, it helps to step back. Since 1945, the U.S. has stood at the center of every significant Western economic and technological structure. From Bretton Woods to GATT, from NATO to Internet standards, America held the role of architect, rule setter, and final arbiter. That picture has now fractured in a fundamental way. Artificial intelligence and digital technology are the industrial revolution of the 21st century. Whoever sets the standards will determine who governs the future. If these 5 economies align their frameworks among themselves and the U.S. remains outside, American technology companies will be forced to operate across 2 separate regulatory universes. Compliance costs will rise, market access will shrink, and Silicon Valley's competitive edge against global rivals will erode. The result was swift. The Nasdaq suffered its steepest single-day decline in 14 months. Meta, Alphabet, and Microsoft, among others, took significant hits. Nothing was wrong with their businesses. The market had simply begun to recognize that American technological supremacy is not guaranteed. It is a privilege, and that privilege had just been quietly revoked. Crisis in the White House. As Carney's 3 announcements radiated outward from Brussels, genuine chaos took hold in Washington. Trump's economic advisors split into 2 opposing camps. One faction argued that retaliation was unavoidable: expand the tariffs, sanction Canadian banks, freeze Canadian assets, declare full economic warfare. The other argued the opposite. Carney had outmaneuvered every front. The existing losses needed to be stopped before they became permanent. The administration needed to return to the table and find a solution. But Trump was listening to neither camp. He was listening to his instincts, and those instincts told him the same thing they always do. Never back down, never apologize, always attack. 14 posts arrived in 12 hours. Carney was called a puppet of European socialists. The EU agreement was declared a joke that would collapse within a week. Threats were made to sanction Canadian banks. Suggestions were floated about withdrawing from NATO. But conspicuously absent from any of these messages was a phone call. No envoy was dispatched. No negotiation was offered. Every communication consisted of insults and threats. The world was watching, and the world was drawing conclusions. The strategic brilliance of Carney's approach. To understand the true depth of the strategy Carney deployed throughout this period, you need to understand how he reads the world. Carney grasps something fundamental. In the 21st century, economic power derives not from size but from connectivity. The U.S. is the world's largest economy. That remains true. But being the largest loses its meaning the moment others decide to root around you. Trump sees the economy as a series of individual transactions. You give me this, I give you that. In this framework, power is measured by who carries the bigger checkbook to the table. But in Carney's worldview, the economy is a network. And in a network, what matters is not who holds the largest node, but who maintains the most connections. What happens when you bully a central node in a network? The other nodes look for new paths. They build new connections. And once those connections exist, they do not disappear when the bullying stops. They are permanent. None of the individual connections Carney built with Europe, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Australia can replace the U.S. market on its own. But together, they prove something. The U.S. market is not the only option. And once that truth is genuinely internalized by the world, the leverage Washington has exercised for 80 years begins to dissolve. Carney was not negotiating with Trump. He was redesigning the future. Trump was not even in the room. Years of quiet preparation. Behind this strategy lay not a flash of inspiration, but a long and methodical preparation. From the day he took office, Carney anticipated that a scenario like this could arrive. He analyzed the rise of economic nationalism, the tendency toward unilateral American action, and Canada's structural vulnerabilities. Canada was an economy that exported raw materials, sold finished goods largely to the American market, and had tied its energy revenues to a single customer. That dependence was not a strength. It was a vulnerability. Carney worked systematically to eliminate it. Groundwork with Europe was laid quietly. Energy dialogues were opened with Japan and South Korea. Technical consultations with allies developed shared frameworks for the digital economy. All of it advanced in confidentiality, far from the public agenda. Trump announced his moves with performative noise. Carney remained silent until the moment he was ready to act, and when he acted, it was on 3 fronts simultaneously in a single morning. The timing was as powerful as the content. The real costs, what lies beyond the numbers. Beyond the market data, the effects of this confrontation on ordinary people's lives are more concrete and more painful. For a worker living in Michigan, this crisis is anything but abstract. The state's economy rests on an automotive supply chain that continuously crosses the Canadian border. Every link of that chain is under pressure. Manufacturers are scouting alternative suppliers. Mexico is being evaluated. Overseas options are on the table. And once those relationships are established, they do not unwind when the tariffs end. For the people who lose jobs in the meantime, economic theory is no consolation. For residents of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, energy costs are becoming unpredictable. The flow of Canadian energy southward has kept heating bills manageable in those states. If that flow is redirected toward the Pacific, even partially, Those states will be competing with Japan and South Korea for the same barrel of oil. Competitiveness drops, costs rise. For those working in the technology sector, the situation differs, but the outcome is equally serious. The Digital Alliance will require American companies to operate in compliance with two separate regulatory systems. Large firms can absorb that burden, but for mid-sized companies it represents a financial weight that will compress margins and eliminate competitive advantage. Retirement accounts may represent the most painful dimension of all. The volatility sweeping through markets directly affects the savings of millions of people preparing for old age. Losses that appear only on paper today can generate consequences that permanently damage retirement plans built over a lifetime. The question of moral authority. Far beyond the economic data, the political and moral dimensions of this crisis have produced a deep and lasting rupture. Canada is historically America's most reliable ally. The two countries have fought side by side in every major conflict. When American passengers were stranded on September 11th, Canadian cities took them in. The border between the two countries is the most enduring testament to a neighborly relationship unmatched in modern history. Now that country has been designated a national security threat. And the rest of the world has taken note. Denmark has taken note. Australia has taken note. Allies across the Far East have taken note. Every country is now running the same calculation. If this is what was done to Canada, what might be done to us? That question is not only reshaping trade agreements, it is reshaping military alliances, diplomatic commitments, and security guarantees. Can America's word be trusted? Will it honor its pledges? Can a country that is a friend today be declared an adversary tomorrow? Every capital where those questions echo is recalibrating its relationship with the U.S. Multilateral frameworks are being sought in place of bilateral arrangements. Alternative partnerships are being architected to reduce dependence on Washington. This process is quiet but advancing rapidly. For 80 years, the U.S. was the architect and guarantor of the liberal international order, a structure built on free trade, the rule of law, and the honoring of alliance commitments. The people now hearing that structure crack are not only Canadians. Two scenarios, no middle ground. Two distinct paths are visible for where this goes from here. The first path could open through institutional intervention. If the automotive sector, energy companies, and major technology firms recognize that the cost of this confrontation has far exceeded any projection and deliver a coordinated, forceful message to Washington, policy can shift. Elected representatives in border states may recall what they owe their constituents and raise their voices. Cornered by market losses and public pressure, Trump might crack open a door to a face-saving formula. Carney, prudent and pragmatic by disposition, could offer a framework for resolution that preserves Canada's gains without demanding capitulation. The end of this path is not a deep reconciliation, but it would be at minimum a warm ceasefire, and the new trade partnerships would remain in place permanently. The second path descends into a spiral. If the U.S. retaliates against the European partnership, the EU expands the trade war. If Japan steps back from American debt instruments, the dollar weakens. The global economy fractures into competing blocs. Deglobalization inflicts permanent damage across a process spanning decades. In this scenario, everyone loses, but not equally. Those who lose the most, as always, are those with the least power. Between these two paths, there is no genuine middle ground. Either institutions work or the crisis deepens. Broken trust and the permanent mark. Even if this confrontation is resolved tomorrow, it will leave a mark that cannot be erased. Trust is the hardest thing to repair. Canada now knows, when political circumstances make it convenient, Washington is capable of treating it as an adversary. That knowledge reframes every bilateral relationship going forward. In every negotiation, a margin of caution will be calculated in the background. Behind every commitment, a guarantee will be sought. Every offer of cooperation will carry with it the implicit question, what happens next time? Canada, for its part, has proven something to the world. A country that is aware of its own vulnerability can transform that vulnerability into a far more powerful strategic asset. The dependence was mutual. Everyone knew it, but no one had ever deployed it this openly, this systematically, as a political lever. The essence of Carney's legacy in this moment is this: you do not need to be the biggest. You need to build smart connections, finance, diplomacy, and timing. Without weapons, without bloodshed, without being the second largest economy, can shift the balance of power. That lesson applies not only to Ottawa, but to every small and mid-sized economy on Earth. And the fact that it has been lived out so visibly, so thoroughly documented, creates a reference point for every similar confrontation that follows. Conclusion: history being written. Economic history is usually read in retrospect, but the period unfolding right now may be remembered years from now as the beginning of a transformation witnessed in real time. The redefinition of the U.S.-Canada relationship, the displacement of a cornerstone in global trade architecture, the emergence of a pluralistic framework for digital economy standards, the redrawing of energy routes. None of these are abstract matters. They are developments that directly affect the jobs, savings plans, energy bills, and global standing of ordinary people. And one of the architects of this new landscape made history without firing a single shot, without declaring a single war. Through 3 announcements made in the space of one morning. The world is changing, fast. And what determines where that change leads may not be the muscle of great powers, but the intelligence of smaller ones. This piece examines current developments in economics and foreign policy from an independent perspective.